The wind hit 100 miles per hour just after midnight on October 15, 1847, tearing across the Appalachian Ridge with enough force to splinter oak trees and collapse stone chimneys. When dawn broke over the devastation, only one homestead remained standing, protected by a massive earthwork trench that neighbors had spent 4 years calling the most foolish waste of labor they'd ever witnessed. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity like this resonate with you. Hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale involves an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. Ezekiel Tate stood in the doorway of his cabin as gray dawn light spread across the ridge, revealing what the darkness had mercifully hidden. Smoke rose from 3 separate locations where collapsed chimneys still smoldered. Timber lay scattered across cleared fields like discarded kindling. The Whitmore place, visible a quarter mile to the east, had been reduced to a foundation and a pile of shattered logs. Beyond it, the Hastings cabin showed only 2 walls still standing, both leaning at angles that defied immediate collapse. Further down the ridge, the McAllister homestead had simply vanished, swept so completely that only the stone hearth remained to mark where a family had lived for 6 years. Ezekiel's cabin stood untouched. The roof showed no damage. The door hung square on its hinges. The windows remained intact. Even his woodpile, stacked against the north wall, had not shifted. He walked 20 paces from his door to the edge of the excavation that had preserved everything. The wind pit stretched 40 feet along the western exposure of his property, 8 feet deep with walls of packed earth that showed fresh scars where wind-driven debris had struck during the night. Small branches and torn canvas lay at the bottom of the trench, evidence of the storm's fury, but the earthwork itself remained solid and unchanged. He heard voices and turned to see Luther Hastings approaching from the east, accompanied by 2 other men Ezekiel recognized as Garrett Finch and Duncan McAllister. All 3 looked exhausted, clothing torn, faces marked with cuts from flying debris. Luther stopped at the edge of the wind pit and stared into it for a long moment before speaking. His cabin, built the same year as Ezekiel's using identical materials and methods, had been destroyed. The only difference between the 2 homesteads had been this excavation that Luther had called a fool's errand for 4 years. "My family spent the night in the root cellar," Luther said quietly. "We heard our cabin go just after midnight. Sounded like it exploded." He looked from the pit to Ezekiel's intact structure. "Sarah and the children are safe, but everything we owned is gone." Garrett Finch moved closer to examine the trench. He was a thick-shouldered man who had helped raise Ezekiel's cabin walls in the summer of 1843, and who had openly laughed when Ezekiel announced his plans to dig this massive excavation. Now Garrett walked the length of the pit, studying the dimensions and positioning with the intensity of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. Duncan McAllister said nothing. His homestead had been swept away completely during the night. His wife and infant son had survived only because Duncan had insisted they shelter in a neighbor's stone spring house when the barometric pressure began falling the previous afternoon. Everything else was gone. The spring storm of 1842 arrived without warning on April 9th, moving up the western slope of the Appalachian Range with unusual speed and violence. Ezekiel Tate, then 23 years old, had been working in his father's tobacco field when the wind began building. He remembered the sky turning a peculiar yellow-green color and the abrupt silence that fell across the ridge as birds stopped calling. His father, Thomas Tate, had looked up from the furrow he was plowing and told Ezekiel to get the horses into the barn. The tone in his father's voice carried urgency that Ezekiel had rarely heard. By the time Ezekiel secured the animals, the wind had reached what he estimated was 60 miles per hour. He ran toward the cabin where his father, stepmother, Ruth, and younger brother Caleb had taken shelter. The structure was 12 years old, built using standard ridgetop construction methods. Logs notched at corners, wood-shingled roof, positioned on high ground to avoid valley fog and maximize sunlight for the surrounding fields. Thomas Tate had built it with help from 6 neighbors, completing the work in 5 days during the summer of 1830. It had survived every storm since, showing no signs of weakness. Ezekiel was 50 yards from the cabin when the wind shifted direction suddenly, coming straight from the west instead of the southwest. The shift lasted perhaps 30 seconds. But those seconds changed everything. The western wall of the cabin, struck by wind at a new angle, buckled inward. Ezekiel saw the ridgepole snap, heard the crack even over the wind's roar. The roof collapsed onto the northern half of the structure where his father and Ruth had been standing. Caleb, who had been near the door on the southern end, was thrown clear as the walls came down. Ezekiel reached the wreckage as rain began falling in heavy sheets. He found Caleb first, unconscious but breathing, lying in mud 15 feet from where the door had been. He dragged his brother clear and returned to the collapsed structure. It took him 20 minutes to locate his father beneath roof timbers and broken logs. Thomas Tate was dead, his chest crushed by the ridgepole. Ruth was found nearby, also dead, killed by the same structural failure. The entire collapse had taken less than 10 seconds from the moment the wall buckled to the moment the roof came down. Caleb regained consciousness an hour later as neighbors arrived to help. He had a broken arm and severe bruising, but he could walk. He and Ezekiel spent that night in Luther Hastings' cabin a half-mile away, along with 4 other families whose homes had been damaged. The storm passed by morning, leaving the ridge scattered with debris and 3 homesteads completely destroyed. Thomas Tate's cabin was a total loss. 2 other families had lost their structures, though no one else had died. The community held a funeral service 3 days later. Thomas and Ruth Tate were buried on the hillside, overlooking the land Thomas had cleared. Ezekiel stood at the graves with Caleb beside him, listening to words about God's will and the unpredictable nature of mountain weather. The phrases were meant to provide comfort, but they struck Ezekiel as inadequate explanations for what had happened. His father had built a solid cabin using proven methods. It had stood for 12 years. Then one shift in wind direction had killed 2 people and destroyed everything. Ezekiel spent the summer of 1842 living with Caleb in Luther Hastings' cabin while they rebuilt on their father's land. But something had changed in how Ezekiel approached the work. Where other men simply replicated standard construction methods, Ezekiel began asking questions that made neighbors uncomfortable. Why had some cabins on the ridge survived the April storm while others collapsed? Why did valley homesteads rarely fail during high winds? What specific forces caused structural failure, and could those forces be predicted or redirected? He started walking the ridge every morning before beginning the day's work, studying how wind moved across the landscape. He noticed that certain rock formations created turbulence, while others seemed to channel air smoothly. He observed how trees bent and broke, noting that damage was always most severe on the windward side of the ridge where structures faced incoming weather. He examined the 3 destroyed cabins carefully, measuring the orientation of collapsed walls and documenting which structural elements had failed first. Luther Hastings found this behavior peculiar. "You planning to build a cabin or write a book about wind?" he asked one morning as Ezekiel crouched beside the remains of the McAllister place, sketching the pattern of fallen timbers in a small journal he had begun keeping. Ezekiel didn't answer immediately. He was focused on understanding why the western wall had buckled while the eastern wall remained partially standing. The pattern suggested that wind striking a structure at ground level created maximum stress on vertical supports. By autumn, Ezekiel had developed a theory that seemed obvious once stated, but was contrary to accepted practice. Ridgetop homesteads failed because they presented full exposure to wind at the most vulnerable point where walls met ground. Wind striking at this level pushed directly against vertical logs with nothing to reduce the force. If wind could be redirected to pass over a structure rather than through it, the stress on walls would be significantly reduced. The question was how to accomplish this redirection using available materials and methods. Ezekiel completed his cabin in November 1842. It was slightly smaller than his father's structure, built with careful attention to corner joints and wall stability, but otherwise unremarkable. He positioned it on the same high ground his father had chosen, maintaining the family's cleared fields. Caleb, whose broken arm had healed but left him with permanent stiffness in his left elbow, moved into the new cabin with Ezekiel. The brothers worked the land together through the winter, trapping and hunting to supplement their income. In March of 1843, Ezekiel announced his intention to dig what he called a wind deflection trench along the western side of his cabin. He explained his theory to Caleb first, describing how an excavation positioned perpendicular to prevailing winds would force incoming air to either drop into the depression or rise over it, creating a buffer zone that would protect the structure. Caleb listened politely, then asked if Ezekiel planned to spend his entire spring digging a ditch instead of planting crops. Word of Ezekiel's plan spread through the ridge community within days. Luther Hastings stopped by to examine the proposed excavation site. "You're telling me you want to dig a hole 8 feet deep and 40 feet long right beside your cabin because you think it'll stop wind?" Luther's tone carried the careful patience of someone addressing a young man who had clearly lost perspective. Ezekiel confirmed that was exactly his intention, and Luther shook his head slowly before walking back to his own homestead. Ezekiel began excavation on April 1, 1843, exactly 1 year after the storm that had killed his father. He started at the southwestern corner of his property, 20 feet from the cabin's western wall, and marked a line extending 40 feet north. The positioning was deliberate, calculated based on months of observing how wind moved across the ridge during storms. Prevailing weather came from the west and southwest. Any excavation meant to redirect wind needed to intercept those patterns before air reached the cabin walls. Luther Hastings arrived mid-morning on the second day to find Ezekiel 3 feet down into hard clay soil. "You're serious about this," Luther said, watching Ezekiel work with a mattock and shovel. Ezekiel paused to wipe sweat from his face and explained the engineering principle he was attempting to apply. When wind encountered a depression in the landscape, it behaved like water encountering a hole. The air mass had momentum and couldn't change direction instantly. Some wind would drop into the excavation, losing speed and force as it hit the bottom and swirled. The rest would be deflected upward, passing over the depression and continuing at a higher elevation. Either way, the ground-level wind striking his cabin would be significantly reduced. Luther listened carefully, then pointed out the obvious problem. "That assumes wind behaves the way you think it does. What if you're wrong? You'll have spent 3 months digging a useless hole." Ezekiel acknowledged the risk, but noted that traditional cabin construction had failed repeatedly during severe storms. His father's death proved that standard methods offered inadequate protection. Even if the wind pit failed to work as designed, he would be no worse off than neighbors who built without any wind protection at all. At least he was attempting to solve a problem rather than accepting preventable deaths as God's will. The excavation proceeded slowly. Clay soil required constant mattock work to break it loose before it could be shoveled out. Ezekiel worked alone, refusing offers of help from Caleb or neighbors. This was his theory, his experiment, and he would complete it himself. By the end of April, he had reached 5 feet deep along the entire 40-foot length. By mid-May, he was at 7 feet. The walls of the pit were nearly vertical, cut as straight as he could manage. Spoiled dirt was piled on the eastern side of the excavation, creating an additional berm between the pit and his cabin. Garrett Finch stopped by in late May and peered into the trench. "Wind Pit Tate," he said, using the nickname that had begun circulating through the community. "That's what folks are calling you now. You know that?" Ezekiel knew. He had heard the name used at the trading post and during Sunday gatherings. It was meant as mockery, but he found he didn't particularly care what people called him. The excavation was nearly complete. By early June, he had reached 8 feet deep along the full length, with walls packed smooth and a flat bottom that would facilitate drainage. The final dimensions of the wind pit took shape through June of 1843. 8 feet deep, 40 feet long, and 12 feet wide at the top, narrowing slightly to 10 feet at the bottom. Ezekiel had excavated approximately 3,800 cubic feet of soil, all removed by hand using a mattock, shovel, and wooden carrying frame he had built specifically for hauling dirt up from the deepening trench. The physical labor was brutal. His hands developed calluses that cracked and bled, then hardened into permanent ridges across his palms. The positioning relative to his cabin was critical. 20 feet of open ground separated the eastern edge of the pit from his western wall. This gap served two purposes. First, it prevented any possibility of excavation undermining his foundation. Second, it created a buffer zone where deflected wind would have space to dissipate before reaching the structure. The pit ran parallel to the cabin's western face, extending from the southwest corner to a point 15 feet past the northwest corner. This coverage protected the entire windward exposure. Ezekiel paid obsessive attention to the wall angles. He wanted them as close to vertical as possible without risking collapse. Clay soil held a vertical face reasonably well when dry, but spring rains tested the walls repeatedly. Twice he had to reshape sections where water infiltration caused slumping. He learned to cut drainage channels at the base of each wall, allowing water to flow along the bottom of the pit rather than saturating the walls. The bottom itself was graded with a slight slope from south to north, directing any accumulated water toward a drainage outlet he had cut at the northern end. The spoil dirt created a secondary feature he had not originally planned. 3,800 cubic feet of excavated soil piled along the eastern edge of the pit formed a berm approximately 3 feet high and 6 feet wide, running the length of the excavation. This elevated mound created an easy additional barrier between the wind pit and his cabin. Any wind that managed to cross the pit would then encounter this raised earthwork before reaching his walls. The combination of depression and elevation created a more complex wind deflection system than Ezekiel had initially envisioned. Neighbors continued passing by to observe the progress. Some comments were openly derisive. Duncan McAllister asked if Ezekiel planned to stock the pit with fish and call it a pond. Garrett Finch suggested it would make a fine mass grave when the next epidemic came through. But a few visitors asked genuine questions about the engineering theory. A young homesteader named Tobias Renfro, recently arrived from Virginia, spent an afternoon examining the excavation and asking about wind behavior patterns. Ezekiel explained his observations and calculations. Tobias listened carefully but made no commitment to attempting similar construction on his own property. By late June, the excavation was complete. Ezekiel planted his crops late that year, weeks behind his neighbors, but he had accomplished what he set out to do. The wind pit was finished. Now he could only wait for the next major storm to test whether his theory was sound or whether he had wasted 3 months digging a monument to foolishness. Ezekiel did not stop with the wind pit. Throughout the summer and fall of 1843, he implemented additional modifications to his cabin based on the same wind deflection principles that had guided his excavation work. Each change was calculated to reduce the force of wind striking the structure or to strengthen points where stress would concentrate during severe weather. The modifications were subtle enough that casual visitors might not notice them, but they represented a systematic approach to wind protection that went far beyond standard frontier construction. The roof angle was his first priority. Standard cabin roofs in the region were built with relatively shallow cabin pitches, typically rising 4 feet for every 12 feet of horizontal distance. This shallow angle was easier to construct and required less material, but Ezekiel had observed that shallow roofs caught wind like sails during storms. He modified his roof to a steeper pitch, rising 7 feet for every 12 feet of horizontal run. The steeper angle allowed wind to flow over the structure more smoothly, reducing uplift forces that could tear shingles loose or, in extreme cases, remove the entire roof structure. He reinforced the leeward wall, the eastern face of his cabin that would receive deflected wind passing over the structure. Most builders assumed the windward wall needed the most reinforcement, but Ezekiel's theory suggested otherwise. Wind deflecting over a structure created turbulence and downdrafts on the leeward side. He added internal bracing to the eastern wall, installing diagonal supports that connected the top logs to the floor joists. These braces were invisible from outside but provided significant resistance to any force trying to push the wall inward. The chimney received special attention. Standard stone chimneys were built on the exterior of cabins, attached to one wall. Ezekiel had noticed that external chimneys often failed during high winds because they presented a tall, narrow target for wind forces. He rebuilt his chimney to be partially interior, with only the upper section extending above the roofline. The bulk of the chimney mass was inside the cabin, protected by the walls and contributing thermal mass that improved heating efficiency. The exposed section above the roof was reinforced with iron straps he had purchased during a trip to the settlement at Jonesboro. Additional earthwork extended beyond the main wind pit. Ezekiel created smaller berms on the northern and southern ends of his property, positioned to redirect wind that might approach from angles other than due west. These secondary berms were only 2 feet high and 20 feet long. But they represented the same principle applied to different wind directions. He was building a comprehensive wind management system rather than a single defensive feature. The final modification involved his woodpile. Rather than stacking firewood against the cabin wall, as most homesteaders did, Ezekiel built a separate covered woodshed 30 feet south of the cabin. His reasoning was simple. Loose firewood could become projectiles during extreme winds. By isolating his fuel supply in a separate structure, he reduced the risk of wind-driven wood damaging his cabin walls or windows. The woodshed itself was built low and heavy, designed to either survive storms or collapse without threatening the main structure. The storm season of 1843 brought nothing remarkable. Autumn winds were moderate, winter storms dropped heavy snow but generated only typical gusts, and spring of 1844 arrived with gentle rains that caused no structural concerns. Across the ridge, Ezekiel's wind pit sat empty and unused, a stark earthwork feature that neighbors passed regularly on their way to the trading post. The excavation became a landmark of sorts. Directions to new homesteads were given in relation to Tate's wind ditch. The feature was too large and too obvious to ignore, even if its purpose remained unproven. Caleb moved out in May of 1844, marrying a woman named Sarah from a family that had settled on the eastern slope. He built his own cabin 4 miles from Ezekiel's property using standard construction methods. When Ezekiel suggested incorporating a wind pit, Caleb declined politely. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," Caleb said. "But I can't spend my first spring as a married man digging an 8-foot hole." The decision was reasonable, but it left Ezekiel alone with his theories and his solitary homestead. The summer of 1845 passed without incident. Ezekiel maintained his wind pit, clearing debris that accumulated in the bottom and repairing minor erosion damage to the walls. The maintenance became part of his routine, requiring approximately 1 day of work each month. Some neighbors commented that he was wasting time on upkeep for a feature that served no function. Luther Hastings suggested, more than once, that Ezekiel should fill in the excavation and reclaim the land for farming. The 20-foot buffer zone between the pit and cabin represented productive soil that was sitting unused. 1846 brought a moderate storm in October that generated winds Ezekiel estimated at 45 miles per hour. The wind pit performed exactly as designed. He stood in his doorway during the storm's peak and observed wind dropping into the excavation, creating visible turbulence as air masses swirled in the confined space. The sound was distinctive, a deep howling that resonated differently than wind passing over open ground. His cabin experienced minimal stress. Shutters rattled but held secure. The roof showed no movement. Meanwhile, Luther Hastings reported losing several shingles, and Duncan McAllister's chicken coop was destroyed. But 45 miles per hour was not a severe test. The storm that had killed Ezekiel's father had generated winds at least 60 miles per hour, possibly higher. Until the wind pit was tested by truly dangerous conditions, its value remained theoretical. The ridge community's opinion solidified into a general consensus. Tate's wind pit was an elaborate waste of effort, a monument to one man's obsession with a problem that could be managed through standard construction and acceptance of occasional losses. People stopped asking Ezekiel about his engineering theories. The questions were replaced by polite silence and subtle suggestions that he should focus on finding a wife and starting a family rather than maintaining an empty trench. By the spring of 1847, Ezekiel had lived alone for 3 years, farming his land and maintaining his modified homestead, while the community gradually forgot why he had built his peculiar fortification in the first place. October 14, 1847, began with unusual atmospheric conditions that Ezekiel recognized immediately. The morning air was unnaturally still, with no breeze moving through the trees. The sky showed a pale, washed-out quality that made distant ridges appear closer than their actual distance. Birds were absent from their normal feeding areas. By midday, the barometric pressure had dropped noticeably. Ezekiel owned no scientific instruments, but he could feel the change in his ears and sinuses, a sensation he had learned to associate with approaching severe weather. He spent the afternoon securing his property. Livestock were moved into the barn and given extra feed and water. Tools were brought inside or lashed down. Shutters were closed and barred on all windows. He checked the wind pit one final time, clearing several small branches that had accumulated over the previous weeks. The excavation was in excellent condition, walls solid, drainage channels clear. By sunset, his preparations were complete. He ate a cold supper and settled in to wait. The wind began building around 8 o'clock in the evening. Initially, it came from the southwest, gusting to perhaps 30 miles per hour. Ezekiel could hear it moving through the forest below his ridge, a sound like distant surf. By 9 o'clock, the wind had shifted to due west and intensified to what he estimated was 50 miles per hour. Rain began falling, driven horizontal by the wind. He lit a single candle and sat at his table, listening to the storm's progression. At 10 o'clock, the character of the wind changed. The gusts became sustained force, no longer rising and falling, but blowing continuously at high speed. The sound was no longer surf, but a roar that made normal thought difficult. Ezekiel moved to his western wall and looked through a gun port he had built into the logs. He could see nothing in the darkness, but he could hear the wind pit working. The deep howling sound he had heard during the moderate storm of 1846 was now amplified to a resonant bellow that vibrated through the ground. 11 o'clock brought winds that exceeded anything Ezekiel had experienced. The cabin shook but held steady. His roof showed no movement despite forces that he estimated were approaching 80 or 90 miles per hour. Through the gun port, he occasionally glimpsed debris flying past, illuminated briefly when lightning flashed. Tree branches, torn shingles, unidentifiable fragments of structures being destroyed elsewhere on the ridge. None of it struck his cabin. The wind pit was deflecting the airflow exactly as designed, forcing the wind mass upward so that projectiles passed overhead rather than impacting his walls. Just after midnight, the wind reached its peak. Ezekiel estimated the sustained speed at 100 miles per hour, with gusts potentially higher. The roar was so loud that he heard nothing else. He crouched against his interior eastern wall, the most protected location in the cabin, and waited. The peak lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then, gradually, the wind began to decrease. By 2 o'clock in the morning, it had dropped to 70 miles per hour. By 4 o'clock, it was down to 40. By dawn, the storm had passed. Ezekiel opened his door at first light to find a landscape transformed by destruction. The immediate area around his cabin showed scattered debris, broken branches, and torn vegetation, but his structure stood completely intact. 20 feet away, the wind pit contained a chaotic collection of storm refuse. Branches, shingles, pieces of canvas, shattered wood planks, and unidentifiable fragments filled the bottom of the excavation to a depth of approximately 2 feet. The walls of the pit showed fresh gouges where large objects had struck during the night, but the earthwork itself remained structurally sound. He walked to the northern end of his property and looked across the ridge. The devastation was comprehensive and shocking. Luther Hastings' cabin, a quarter mile to the northeast, had collapsed completely. Only the stone chimney remained standing, rising from a pile of logs and roofing material. The Whitmore place to the east showed 2 walls still vertical, but the roof was gone and the remaining walls leaned at precarious angles. Duncan McAllister's homestead had been swept away so thoroughly that Ezekiel could barely identify where it had stood. The stone hearth marked the location, but everything else had vanished. Smoke rose from multiple locations where damaged chimneys continued burning wood from collapsed structures. The forest below the ridge showed extensive damage. Hundreds of trees were down, creating a tangle of trunks and branches that would take months to clear. The main road through the settlement was completely blocked by fallen timber. Ezekiel counted 6 homesteads visible from his property, and all 6 showed major damage or total destruction. His cabin was the only structure that remained functionally intact. Luther Hastings arrived first, accompanied by Garrett Finch and Duncan McAllister. All 3 men were injured to varying degrees. Luther had a deep cut above his left eye. Garrett's right hand was wrapped in torn cloth, blood seeping through. Duncan appeared physically unharmed, but moved with the stunned slowness of someone in shock. They stood at the edge of the wind pit and stared into it for a long time before anyone spoke. "My family is alive," Luther finally said. "We were in the root cellar when the cabin went. But everything we own is gone." He gestured toward the wind pit. "This worked. This actually worked." The statement was not a question. The evidence was impossible to dispute. Ezekiel's cabin stood undamaged, while every other structure on the ridge had been destroyed or severely damaged. The only variable was the wind pit and associated modifications that neighbors had spent 4 years calling foolish. More people arrived throughout the morning. Families who had survived the storm in root cellars, barns, or by fleeing to lower elevations came to see the cabin that had withstood winds that destroyed everything else. Tobias Renfro, the young homesteader who had asked detailed questions about wind deflection theory back in 1843, examined the wind pit carefully and asked if Ezekiel would help him build one when he rebuilt his destroyed cabin. Ezekiel agreed immediately. Within hours, 3 other men made similar requests. The mockery had ended. The validation was absolute and undeniable. The rebuilding began within days of the Big Gale. Ezekiel's cabin became the temporary shelter and meeting point for displaced families while new structures were planned. The first decision every homesteader made was whether to incorporate a wind pit into their reconstruction. Of the 11 families who had lost cabins on the ridge, 9 chose to excavate wind deflection trenches before raising their walls. The 2 who declined were families planning to relocate to valley locations where wind protection was less critical. Ezekiel spent the late autumn of 1847 helping neighbors design and dig their excavations. Each site required individual assessment based on topography, prevailing wind direction, and available space. Luther Hastings' new wind pit was positioned slightly differently than Ezekiel's, angled to account for a rock outcropping that created localized wind turbulence. Tobias Renfro's excavation was longer but slightly shallower, adapted to soil conditions that made 8-foot depths impractical. Duncan McAllister built his new cabin in a different location entirely, choosing a site with natural wind protection from a hillside, but he still added a modest wind pit as additional security. The technique spread beyond the immediate community. Travelers passing through the ridge settlement saw the excavations and asked about their purpose. When they learned that these earthworks had protected structures during winds that destroyed standard cabins, many carried the information to other communities. By the spring of 1848, reports reached Ezekiel of wind pits being dug in settlements 30 miles distant. The innovation was spreading organically, carried by people who understood that frontier survival often depended on learning from the successes and failures of others. Ezekiel married in 1849. Her name was Abigail, daughter of a family that had moved to the region after the Big Gale. She had grown up in Pennsylvania and brought knowledge of different construction techniques that Ezekiel found fascinating. They had 3 children over the following 6 years, raising them in the cabin that had survived the storm. The wind pit remained a permanent feature of their property, maintained carefully, and pointed out to visitors as the innovation that had saved everything. The physical evidence of Ezekiel's work persisted far beyond his lifetime. He died in 1873 at age 54, buried on his property overlooking the ridge where he had spent most of his life. His cabin remained occupied by his descendants until 1891, when the family moved to lower elevation farmland. But even after the cabin was abandoned, the wind pit remained visible. The earthwork was too substantial to erode quickly. Travelers in the early 1900s reported seeing the excavation still clearly defined, a strange trench beside ruins of an old cabin. Modern archaeological surveys of Appalachian settlement sites have identified at least 17 wind pits in the region, all dating from the mid-1800s. The features are recognized now as innovative frontier engineering, examples of practical problem-solving by people who had no formal training, but understood that survival required adapting to local conditions. Ezekiel Tate's name appears in few historical records, but his solution to an impossible problem remains carved into the landscape itself.